Picture this: the most feared warrior in history is marching toward your city with a vast, fearsome army. Attila the Hun has been sweeping through Gaul and is feared across the region, leaving destruction in his wake. Paris trembles as refugees flood the streets with horrific tales of burned cities and scattered populations. While city leaders debate fleeing, one young woman steps forward with an impossible plan. Instead of running, she convinces the entire city to do something that sounds like madness. Tonight, discover how Saint Genevieve's radical act of faith didn't just save Paris, it became a testament to the power of communal prayer and divine protection. But who was this woman who would dare challenge both earthly logic and supernatural terror? Picture a 29-year-old stepping forward when seasoned military leaders falter and politicians scramble for safety. This is Genevieve of Nanterre in the year when seasoned military leaders falter and politicians scramble for safety. This is Genevieve of Nanterre in the year 451, and everything about her background screams impossibility for the task ahead. Born in the humble village of Nanterre, just outside Paris, she came from ordinary farming stock. No royal blood, no military training, no political connections that could command armies or negotiate with emperors. Her path to this moment began with an encounter that changed everything. At age 7, young Genevieve met Saint Genevieve during one of his missionary journeys through Gaul. According to her early vita and tradition, the holy bishop recognized something extraordinary in this child and consecrated her as a virgin dedicated to God's service. He placed a bronze medal around her neck as a sign of her calling, telling her parents that their daughter would serve a purpose beyond anything they could imagine. That small bronze disc became her most treasured possession, a constant reminder of divine appointment. From that day forward, Genevieve lived with radical intensity. For decades she practiced strict fasting, sparse barley bread and beans, long vigils, until bishops later urged moderation. Her prayer life consumed hours each day and night. She slept little, spending dark hours in communion with God while Paris slumbered. This wasn't the comfortable devotion of Sunday worship. This was complete surrender to a spiritual calling that demanded everything from her physical body and daily routine. By her late 20s, stories about Genevieve spread throughout Paris and the surrounding region. Some people traveled considerable distances to seek her prayers for healing. Others came asking for prophetic insight about their families or businesses. She reportedly knew things she had no natural way of knowing. Sick people claimed recovery after her intercession. Barren women conceived children. Lost items appeared in impossible places after she prayed. Yet her growing reputation also attracted skeptics and critics. Religious authorities wondered why she lived in voluntary poverty when she could have married well. Political leaders found her influence among common people concerning, especially since she owed allegiance to no earthly ruler. Some whispered that her visions came from demonic sources rather than divine ones. Now imagine the contrast between this background and the magnitude of the threat bearing down on Paris. Attila commanded a massive invading army. His warriors had conquered territory stretching from the Black Sea to the Rhine River. They moved like a human avalanche, destroying everything in their path. Roman and regional forces struggled against him. Fortified cities surrendered without resistance, rather than endure siege warfare against such overwhelming numbers. What could a woman's prayers possibly accomplish against this sweeping Hunnic force? The question seemed to answer itself. Prayer belonged in quiet chapels, not on battlefields. Spiritual exercises might comfort the soul, but they couldn't turn aside iron weapons or cavalry charges. Every rational person understood that survival meant gathering whatever possessions you could carry and fleeing as fast as possible. The city's desperation grew more intense each day as refugees continued arriving with increasingly horrific reports. Military scouts confirmed that Attila's advance showed no signs of slowing or changing direction. Paris lay directly in his path, and nothing suggested he would bypass such a valuable prize. The Seine River provided no meaningful barrier against his forces. The city walls, while sturdy enough for ordinary conflicts, offered little hope against an army of this size equipped with siege engines and unlimited manpower. Logic demanded immediate evacuation, pack essential belongings, abandon the city to its fate, flee southward ahead of the advancing horde, and hope to find safety somewhere beyond Attila's reach. Every practical consideration supported this course of action. Every military advisor recommended it. Every political leader privately prepared their own escape routes. But Genevieve stood against this tide of rational fear with a conviction that seemed to defy common sense. She believed that divine intervention remained not only possible but certain. Intense prayer and fasting had convinced her that spiritual warfare could indeed triumph over physical force when conducted with absolute trust in God's power. This wasn't passive resignation disguised as faith. Genevieve understood that divine intervention required active human cooperation. God worked through people who committed themselves completely to his purposes, who chose obedience over self-preservation, who acted on spiritual conviction even when circumstances suggested certain disaster. The same divine power that parted the Red Sea and fed 5,000 people could turn aside Attila's army, but only if Paris offered the kind of unified faith that moved heaven to action. Her unwavering belief in God's protection became the foundation for a plan that sounded like madness to everyone who heard it. Instead of fleeing, Paris would stand and fight a spiritual battle. Instead of abandoning their city, they would transform it into a fortress of prayer. Instead of trusting in human wisdom and military strategy, they would stake everything on divine intervention summoned through collective faith and supplication. The woman, who had spent 22 years preparing for this moment through prayer, fasting and growing in spiritual authority, now faced her ultimate test. She would need to convince an entire terrified population to trust her vision when every instinct screamed for immediate flight. But first, that population would need to understand exactly what they were facing. Reports flooding into Paris painted a terrifying picture of devastation. Feel the panic spreading through the city as dusty. Exhausted refugees stumble through the gates with tales that chill the blood. These aren't ordinary war stories. These are accounts of systematic destruction unlike anything the Roman world had witnessed. Picture the scene unfolding in the spring of 451 as messenger after messenger arrives, bearing increasingly desperate news about Attila's unstoppable advance across Gaul. Many towns were devastated on his path, their populations slaughtered or dragged away in chains. The refugees who managed to escape described scenes that haunted their sleepless nights and filled their waking hours with terror. Citizens of Paris gathered in the forum and market squares, listening to these survivors with growing dread. The stories they heard defied comprehension. Entire regions emptied of human life. Fertile farmlands left barren and abandoned. Churches torn down stone by stone. No distinction made between soldier and civilian, young and old, rich and poor. Inside the administrative buildings, the city leaders held urgent council meetings that stretched deep into the night. Military commanders spread maps across wooden tables, tracing Attila's route and calculating distances. The mathematics offered no comfort. At his current pace, the Hun army would reach Paris within weeks, perhaps days. Every strategic assessment reached the same conclusion: resistance was suicide, and evacuation was the only rational response. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens began their own frantic thing for their children, trying to decide which family heirlooms to save and which to abandon. The sound of hammering filled neighborhoods as people boarded up their homes, hoping something might survive the coming storm. The specific horrors described by refugees created a climate of psychological warfare that Attila himself had carefully cultivated. His army didn't simply conquer territory. They destroyed the will to resist before they even arrived. Stories of their brutality traveled faster than their cavalry, creating such fear that cities often surrendered without siege equipment ever being assembled. Attila understood that terror was a weapon more effective than any sword or spear. This psychological campaign had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations. Word spread throughout Gaul that the Hun king showed no mercy to those who opposed him and little more to those who submitted. Cities that fought faced complete destruction. Cities that surrendered faced occupation, tribute, and the constant threat of violence. Cities that surrendered faced occupation, tribute, and the constant threat of violence. Neither choice offered real safety, only different forms of suffering. Even Rome itself trembled before this approaching threat. Emperor Valentinian III and a second already fled from Ravenna, his court in complete disarray. The Western Roman Empire's military forces, once capable of defending vast territories, now scattered like leaves before Attila's advance. If Rome's legions couldn't stand against the Hun army, what hope did Paris have with its modest garrison and citizen militia? Reports reaching Paris confirmed that professional soldiers were abandoning their posts rather than face certain death. Experienced generals recommended withdrawal over resistance. Battle-hardened veterans advised flight over fight. When the Empire's most skilled warriors chose retreat, local populations naturally concluded that heroic stands belonged only in ancient stories, not in the practical world of survival. The atmosphere of despair grew thicker with each passing day. Logical minds examined every option and reached the same inevitable conclusion: immediate evacuation offered the only realistic hope of preserving life. Stay and face annihilation, or flee in life to see another day. The choice seemed obvious to anyone capable of rational thought. Markets closed as merchants loaded their goods onto carts. Schools emptied as teachers prepared to escort their students to safety. Churches held special services as priests blessed families departing for uncertain destinations. The normal rhythms of city life collapsed under the weight of approaching catastrophe. Yet in this moment of universal panic, Genevieve took action that shocked everyone who witnessed it. Instead of joining the exodus or quietly accepting the city's fate, she began moving through Paris with a different message. She sought out women in their homes, in the markets, at the wells where they drew water. Her proposal sounded like madness to ears accustomed to wells where they drew water. Her proposal sounded like madness to ears accustomed to practical solutions and logical planning. Gather the women of Paris for prayer. Fast and vigil instead of flight and fear. Transform terror into spiritual warfare through collective faith and supplication. Meet Attila's physical army with weapons he could neither understand nor defeat. Fight a battle in the heavenly realm while his forces approached in the earthly one. She reframed their crisis through the lens of biblical history, reminding her listeners of moments when God's people faced impossible odds and found deliverance through faith rather than strategy. Esther saving her people from Haman's plot. Judith delivering Bethulia from Holofernes. These weren't ancient fairy tales but historical precedents, showing how divine power worked through human cooperation and trust. The question remained whether anyone would listen to such an extraordinary proposal when every instinct screamed for immediate flight. Genevieve found her answer in the women who chose to stay. Witnessed the moment when desperate mothers and wives gathered in homes and courtyards and stopped at market stalls. Her message carried the weight of divine authority mixed with urgent practicality. The same God who had delivered his people throughout history stood ready to protect Paris, but only if they demonstrated faith worthy of such intervention. She addressed groups of women with words that connected their present crisis to ancient victories. Remember Esther, she told them, who approached the Persian king uninvited to save her people from annihilation. Consider Judith, who entered the enemy camp and defeated Holofernes through courage and divine assistance. These biblical heroines hadn't relied on armies or weapons, but on faith that moved heaven to action. Paris needed that same spiritual warfare now. The skepticism was immediate and understandable. How could prayer stop an army that steel could not defeat? Worried mothers voiced the obvious questions. Their husbands were already loading wagons and planning escape routes. Military leaders had declared resistance hopeless. Even priests were preparing to evacuate sacred vessels and relics. Hopeless. Even priests were preparing to evacuate sacred vessels and relics. What possible good could women accomplish through fasting and prayer when experienced warriors had already given up the fight? But opposition to Genevieve's plan went beyond mere skepticism. Some citizens grew angry at what they saw as dangerous delusion that would cost lives. A mob formed, intent on silencing her before her influence spread further. The situation turned threatening until Germanus' archdeacon intervened to remind the people of Germanus' endorsement, which helped pacify them. The intervention calmed the crowd and allowed Genevieve to continue her mission without physical harm. She met remaining doubts with specific instructions that transformed vague spiritual concepts into concrete action. Continuous fasting would purify their hearts and demonstrate serious commitment to divine intervention. Night vigils in the churches would maintain constant prayer while the city slept. Communal worship would unite their individual supplications into a collective cry for deliverance. This wasn't passive resignation, their individual supplications into a collective cry for deliverance. This wasn't passive resignation, but active spiritual combat requiring discipline and sacrifice. The first women to join her came from different backgrounds and circumstances. A baker's wife who remembered miraculous healings at Genevieve's prayers. A widow whose son had returned safely from military service after seeking her intercession. A merchant's daughter who had witnessed her prophetic gifts firsthand. Each brought her own reasons for trust, and each began inviting friends and neighbors to join the growing prayer campaign. Word spread through Paris with surprising speed. Women talked to each other at wells and in marketplaces. Mothers shared the news while preparing meals and caring for children. Sisters visited each other's homes to discuss this alternative to evacuation. She persuaded many of the citizens, especially the women who stayed and prayed, though the conversation throughout the city shifted from where to flee to whether divine protection might actually be possible through unified faith and supplication. The transformation began gradually, but instead of helplessly watching their city face destruction, they could actively participate in its defense through weapons Attila had never encountered. Prayer vigils replaced sleepless nights of worry. Fasting provided focus instead of the scattered anxiety that had paralyzed clear thinking. The churches of Paris began filling with women at all hours. What sources often describe as a sustained prayer marathon in the baptistry became the center of the city's spiritual resistance. Dawn prayers drew mothers before their families awakened. Midday services attracted those who could escape household duties. Evening vigils brought together grandmothers and young wives seeking divine intervention through collective worship. The sound of constant prayer replaced the noise of evacuation preparations that had dominated the city for days. Even skeptical husbands began noticing the change in their wives' attitudes. Where fear and panic had previously ruled, they now saw determination and hope. Women who had been packing frantically started organizing prayer schedules instead. The transformation was visible. Had been packing frantically started organizing prayer schedules instead. The transformation was visible and contagious, spreading beyond the original participants to influence entire families and neighborhoods. Some men found themselves drawn into the prayer campaign despite their initial resistance. Fathers who had planned immediate flight started questioning whether they were missing something important. City officials who had dismissed religious solutions began observing the growing movement with curiosity rather than contempt. The spiritual atmosphere in Paris was changing in ways that defied rational explanation. The prayer revolution gained momentum as entire neighborhoods joined the campaign. Streets that had echoed with the sounds of departure preparations now resonated with hymns and spoken prayers. Market squares became gathering places for worship rather than final sales before flight. The character of Paris was shifting from a city preparing to die to a community preparing to fight a spiritual battle. Church bells rang continuously, calling rather than physical escape. This collective act of faith created a supernatural atmosphere that participants and observers alike recognized as extraordinary. Hope replaced despair. Determination conquered panic. Unity emerged from chaos. As the prayer marathon intensified, military scouts continued bringing reports of Attila's relentless advance. The Hun army drew closer each day, and the moment of truth approached when Paris would discover whether their unprecedented spiritual campaign could achieve what no earthly force had managed. Reports from the countryside suddenly carried news that defied every expectation. Picture the confusion as a mounted courier arrived at Paris's gates with intelligence that initially seemed too strange to believe. Instead of continuing his direct march toward the city, Attila had suddenly altered his route. His army had turned southward, heading toward Orléans, rather than maintaining their expected advance on Paris. The messenger reported this development with obvious bewilderment, admitting he had verified the information multiple times before riding hard to deliver such unexpected news. Military leaders gathered to examine these reports with the skepticism of experienced warriors who had learned not to trust fortune too quickly. They questioned the courier repeatedly, demanding details about his sources and the reliability of his observations. Yet subsequent messengers confirmed the initial intelligence. Multiple sources verified that the Hun army had indeed changed direction, moving away from Paris rather than continuing their seemingly inevitable approach to the city walls. Strategic analysts found themselves baffled by this sudden deviation from Attila's expected path. Every military consideration supported a direct assault on Paris. The city controlled crucial river crossings, possessed significant wealth, and represented the kind of symbolic victory that would cement his dominance over Western Gaul. Orléans, while important, offered fewer strategic advantages and less dramatic propaganda value. No logical explanation accounted for this unexpected change in his campaign plans. The confusion deepened as more detailed reports arrived throughout the following days. Attila's forces hadn't simply paused or delayed their advance. They had committed fully to the new direction, with supply trains and siege equipment following the main force toward Orléans, where his advance would be checked in the decisive battle near Chalons. This wasn't a temporary detour, but a complete alteration of strategic objectives that caught Roman intelligence completely off guard. Contemporary chroniclers who witnessed these events struggled to explain what had happened through conventional analysis. Military historians could find no tactical reason for Attila's decision to bypass Paris. Political analysts discovered no diplomatic negotiations or tribute payments that might have influenced his choice. Economic factors provided no compelling explanation for abandoning such a valuable target in favor of a different objective. Yet sources that might have influenced his choice. Economic factors provided no compelling explanation for abandoning such a valuable target in favor of a different objective. Yet sources from the time consistently credited Genevieve's intercession for this deliverance, while military sources noted Attila's redirection and the decisive engagement that followed. Religious writers of the period recorded their conviction that spiritual warfare had achieved what military resistance could never have accomplished. They documented their belief that collective prayer and fasting had moved heaven to protect Paris through means beyond human understanding. The victory was complete and undeniable. Paris had been spared not through military genius or diplomatic negotiation, but through what participants and observers alike recognized as supernatural intervention. The city that had prepared for destruction through spiritual weapons, rather than physical ones, had seen those weapons prove effective against history's most feared conqueror. This deliverance established Genevieve's reputation as something far beyond a local religious figure. She had demonstrated the power of faith-based resistance in the most dramatic circumstances possible, proving that divine protection remained available to communities willing to stake everything on spiritual rather than material solutions. The women who had joined her prayer campaign found their faith vindicated in the most spectacular way imaginable. Churches throughout Paris filled with thanksgiving services as the reality of their salvation sank in. The same sanctuaries that had echoed with desperate supplications now resounded with hymns of praise and gratitude. Families who had prepared for exile instead celebrated their preservation. Children who had watched their parents pack for flight now witnessed victory celebrations in the streets they would not have to abandon. The transformation of the city's atmosphere was immediate and profound. Fear gave way to joy as residents realized they would not face the horrors that had befallen other communities in Attila's path. Markets reopened as merchants unpacked goods they had prepared to carry away. Situation that had dominated recent weeks. Genevieve's influence expanded dramatically as word of the miraculous deliverance spread throughout Gaul and beyond. Pilgrims began arriving in Paris to meet the woman whose prayers had turned aside the most feared army in the world. Religious communities sent delegations to learn about her methods of spiritual warfare. Political leaders who had previously dismissed her influence now sought her counsel on matters of both earthly and heavenly importance. The success of the prayer campaign created a new model for Christian resistance that would inspire communities facing similar threats throughout the collapsing Western Roman Empire. Genevieve had proven that faith could triumph over force when exercised with sufficient commitment and unity. Her example would be remembered and imitated by future generations facing their own moments of crisis and desperation. Yet even as Paris celebrated this extraordinary deliverance, the challenges facing the city were far from over. The same divine protection that had saved them from immediate destruction would soon be tested in ways that none of them could have anticipated. 6. From spiritual victory to political crisis. Years later, during a Frankish siege of Paris, Genevieve faced a crisis that would test her faith in entirely different ways. The joy that had filled the streets after Attila's mysterious retreat seemed like a distant memory as citizens confronted a new enemy who understood that slow starvation could accomplish what swift conquest had failed to achieve. Childeric I, king of the Salian Franks, had surrounded Paris systematically, establishing control over all major roads and river approaches. This wasn't an army passing through on its way to other conquests. This was a deliberate siege designed to starve the city into submission. The new threat differed fundamentally from the Hunnic danger they had escaped. Attila's army moved like a natural disaster, devastating but temporary. His forces struck quickly and moved on, leaving destruction in their wake, but not remaining to occupy territory permanently. Childeric's siege represented something far more sinister that would tighten gradually until Paris had no choice but surrender or death by starvation. Picture the cruel irony of their situation. The same citizens who had celebrated their miraculous deliverance from instant annihilation now faced the prospect of slow death by hunger. The prayers that had turned aside Attila's vast army seemed powerless against the methodical blockade that prevented food wagons from reaching the city markets. Divine intervention had saved them from the sword only to deliver them to starvation. The siege took effect with terrifying efficiency. Childeric's forces established checkpoints on every road leading to Paris. River traffic stopped completely as Frankish boats patrolled the Seine. Farmers from surrounding villages found themselves unable to bring their produce to the city's markets. Grain merchants discovered that their usual supply routes had been severed. Within weeks, the abundant food supplies that had seemed so secure began dwindling at an alarming rate. Food prices rose dramatically as supplies shrank. Bread became expensive, then scarce, then nearly impossible to obtain. Meat disappeared from most tables. Even vegetables grew costly as citizens competed for whatever remained in storage. Families began rationing their meals, stretching whatever food they possessed across more days. Mothers watched their children grow thin, while fathers searched desperately for any source of nourishment. The gradual onset of starvation created a different kind of terror than the approaching Hun army had generated. Attila's threat had been immediate and visible, an external enemy that could be faced or fled. Hunger was insidious and internal, a weakness that grew stronger each day as strength ebbed from bodies that received insufficient nourishment. The enemy wasn't at the gates, but in their own stomachs, gnawing constantly and growing more painful with each passing meal they couldn't afford. Desperation returned to Paris, but this time it took a different form. Instead of panic about immediate destruction, citizens faced the grinding anxiety of watching their resources. Shopkeepers watched their shelves empty, without hope of resupply. City leaders found themselves managing a crisis that couldn't be solved through military action or diplomatic negotiation. The city's leaders naturally turned to Genevieve once again, seeking the same spiritual solution that had delivered them from Attila's threat. Citizens gathered in churches to pray for divine intervention against the siege. Fasting became easier as food grew scarce, but this time it was involuntary rather than chosen for spiritual purposes. The prayer vigils continued, but desperation now, mixed with faith as hungry people, sought miraculous provision rather than protection from invasion. Yet this crisis would demand something different from their patron saint. Prayer had proved effective against the external threat of Hun invasion, but the siege required practical action beyond spiritual warfare. The same divine power that had turned aside Attila's army would need to work through human effort and courage to break Childeric's blockade. Genevieve recognized that faith without works was dead, and this situation called for both spiritual authority and practical leadership. She organized relief missions that brought food into the city, demonstrating that her spiritual gifts extended to practical logistics and negotiation merchants. Communities that might have refused to trade with a besieged city found themselves willing to provide grain to the woman whose prayers had saved Paris from Attila's destruction. The most dramatic of these missions involved her personal journey to secure grain from distant sources while Paris faced starvation. Her vita records that she miraculously opened the closed gates when leaving the city, whether read as literal miracle or as symbolic report. It shows her extraordinary reputation and the desperate circumstances that required such intervention. She also interceded directly with Childeric himself, obtaining leniency for prisoners and demonstrating that her influence extended even to enemy commanders who recognized her spiritual authority. These practical victories prove that divine intervention could work through human courage and action rather than supernatural events alone. Genevieve had evolved from a contemplative virgin focused on prayer and fasting into a leader capable of organizing complex relief operations while maintaining her spiritual credibility. Her success in breaking the siege through both miraculous intervention evolved from a contemplative virgin focused on prayer and fasting into a leader capable of organizing complex relief operations while maintaining her spiritual credibility. Her success in breaking the siege through both miraculous intervention and practical leadership would establish her as a figure of unprecedented influence with rulers and common people alike. The moment came when she announced a plan that would require her to risk everything by venturing far beyond the city walls into hostile territory. She took leadership of a risky supply effort that would test every skill she had developed through decades of spiritual discipline. Picture the scene in her modest dwelling as she outlined her audacious strategy to city leaders who had come seeking spiritual comfort. Instead of offering more prayers and fasting, she proposed something that challenged every assumption about religious women and their proper roles. She would personally lead a grain expedition up the Seine River, venturing into hostile territory to secure food supplies for the starving city. The plan defied logic on multiple levels. Genevieve had never commanded a commercial trade routes. She possessed no experience in supply management or coordinating complex missions. Her entire adult life had been devoted to prayer, fasting, and spiritual ministry within the protected walls of Paris. Yet she spoke with absolute conviction about organizing a flotilla of ships, negotiating with grain merchants in distant cities, and returning with enough food to break Childeric's siege. Consider the staggering dangers inherent in her proposal. The Seine River passed through territory now controlled by hostile forces who had every reason to intercept supply missions bound for Paris. Enemy patrols monitored the waterways, searching for exactly the kind of relief expedition she planned to organize. River navigation itself presented treacherous challenges, with shifting currents, hidden obstacles, and weather conditions that could destroy cargo or sink entire vessels. Beyond the physical perils lay political complications that could prove equally deadly. Genevieve would need to negotiate with merchants and local authorities in cities that might view supplying besieged Paris as an act of war against Childeric. She would have to establish her credentials as a legitimate representative of the city while operating far from any support network. Her success depended entirely on her reputation and personal authority in regions where she was known only by reputation. The journey to Arcis sur Aube and Troyes required travelling upstream against the Seine's current, adding time and difficulty to an already dangerous mission. These cities possessed significant grain stores, but their leaders had their own populations to feed and their own relationships with various Frankish rulers to consider. Genevieve would need to convince them that supporting Paris served their interests while offering payment from a city whose resources were already strained by siege conditions. Picture her arrival in these river towns. This woman, whose reputation for miraculous interventions preceded her, but whose physical appearance suggested anything but commercial leadership. She wore simple religious merchants or the armor of military commanders. Her entourage consisted of a few trusted companions, rather than the armed guards typically required for such negotiations. Yet she spoke with authority about quantities of grain, shipping arrangements, and payment terms that revealed unexpected practical knowledge. The negotiations themselves tested skills she had never formally developed, but somehow possessed. Grain merchants drove hard bargains, knowing that desperate cities paid premium prices for essential supplies. Local officials demanded guarantees and assurances about future relationships. Religious leaders questioned whether supporting a besieged city constituted proper Christian charity or dangerous political involvement. Through each conversation, Genevieve demonstrated a combination of spiritual authority and practical wisdom that gradually overcame skepticism and resistance. Her success exceeded even her own expectations. Not only did she secure commitments for substantial grain shipments, but she also organized the logistics for transporting these supplies back to Paris. 11 ships would carry the precious cargo down the Seine, creating a flotilla large enough to feed the starving city for weeks. Her authority and presence kept the mission together as this religious woman commanded an operation that amazed everyone involved in the arrangements. The return journey presented even greater challenges than the upstream voyage had posed. The loaded ships moved slowly down the river, making them vulnerable to enemy patrols that had time to organize interception attempts. Every bend in the Seine could conceal hostile forces waiting to capture the flotilla and claim its valuable cargo. Weather conditions, mechanical problems, or navigational errors could destroy months of careful planning and leave Paris facing continued starvation. Genevieve traveled with her supply convoy, sharing the dangers faced by the crews and cargo she had worked so hard to assemble. This wasn't delegation from a safe distance, but personal leadership that put her own life at risk for the city's survival. Her presence on the ships demonstrated the same commitment to practical action that had characterized her spiritual ministry. The suspense built as the flotilla approached Paris, while the city's food situation grew more desperate daily. Citizens gathered along the riverbanks, straining their eyes for any sign of approaching vessels. Parents calculated whether their children could survive another week without adequate nutrition. City leaders debated surrender terms they might need to accept if relief didn't arrive soon. Every day of delay brought Paris closer to capitulation. Then came the moment that transformed despair into jubilation. 11 ships appeared on the Seine, their holds heavy with grain and their sails bearing the marks of successful negotiations in distant cities. The Vita records that her prayers preserved the ships through the perilous journey, presenting this as divine protection, working through human courage and determination. Starving Parisians witnessed their salvation, sailing up the river they had watched so anxiously for signs of hope. The woman who had saved them from Attila through prayer had now saved them from Childeric through faith combined with bold action. This practical miracle proved that divine intervention worked through human courage and action just as powerfully as through supernatural events alone. Genevieve had demonstrated that authentic faith required both spiritual discipline and earthly responsibility, both prayer and practical solutions. Her success established her as a leader whose authority transcended traditional categories and conventional expectations, opening doors to influence that would extend far beyond the walls of Paris. Her success with the grain mission opened diplomatic channels that would reshape the political landscape of Gaul. Picture Genevieve in the years following her river expedition, as word of her practical leadership spread throughout the region, alongside stories of her spiritual authority. Kings, who had initially dismissed her as merely another religious figure, now sought meetings with the woman who commanded respect from both heaven and earth. Her combination of divine favor and proven competence created a unique form of political influence that transcended traditional power structures. Childeric himself, hosting private audiences with Genevieve after witnessing her successful relief mission. Her vita and later medieval sources report that she influenced Frankish rulers, including Childeric and Clovis, persuading them to mercy in matters that might otherwise have ended in bloodshed. Imagine the extraordinary nature of these meetings. A pagan warrior king consulting with a consecrated Christian virgin about matters of state and policy. These conversations took place in settings that would have seemed impossible just years earlier, with Childeric treating Genevieve as an equal rather than a subject or curiosity. The delicate balance required in these diplomatic relationships tested skills that no religious training had specifically prepared her for. How do you maintain absolute Christian principles while negotiating with rulers whose worldview centers on conquest, tribute, and pagan gods? Genevieve navigated these conversations by focusing on practical benefits that served both Christian charity and royal interests. She spoke of mercy as good policy, just sentiment, demonstrating how compassionate leadership strengthened rather than weakened political authority. Her most significant diplomatic victories came through prisoner negotiations that saved countless lives. When Childeric's forces captured civilians during various military campaigns, Genevieve requested audiences specifically to secure their release. She approached these meetings with careful preparation, understanding that pagan kings respected strength and despised weakness. Her arguments combined appeals to royal magnanimity with practical considerations about the economic and political benefits of mercy over harsh punishment. Traditional accounts preserve one striking example of how her interventions blended spiritual force and political effect. According to her vita, when she sought to secure prisoners' release, she approached the gates where they were held and found them mysteriously opened at her touch. Whether understood as literal miracle or symbolic representation of her extraordinary influence, the story illustrates how contemporaries viewed her authority as extraordinary influence. The story illustrates how contemporaries viewed her authority as transcending normal political boundaries. Prisoners walked free who might otherwise have faced slavery or death. Families reunited who had been torn apart by the brutal realities of medieval warfare. Childeric found himself repeatedly convinced by arguments that seemed to serve his interests while advancing Christian principles. Picture one such negotiation session where Genevieve presented her case for releasing captured farmers and craftsmen. She spoke not of abstract Christian love, but of concrete advantages. Returned farmers would resume food production that benefited everyone in the region. Released craftsmen would continue creating goods that generated tax revenue. Mercy towards civilians would encourage future surrenders rather than desperate resistance that cost both sides valuable resources. Her reputation for divine favor provided unique leverage in political discussions that secular diplomats could never achieve. Pagan kings who might dismiss Christian could never achieve. Pagan kings who might dismiss Christian theology still recognized supernatural power when they witnessed it. Genevieve's proven track record of miraculous interventions gave her words weight that transcended normal political calculations. When she spoke of divine judgment or blessing, rulers listened with attention they would never grant to ordinary religious figures. The transformation of these relationships reflected broader changes occurring throughout Frankish society as Christianity gradually displaced pagan traditions. Kings who had initially consulted Genevieve out of curiosity or political necessity found themselves genuinely respecting Christian authority and moral principles. Pagan rulers began incorporating Christian advisors into their courts and Christian considerations into their policies. When Clovis succeeded his father Childeric as king of the Franks, Genevieve's established influence provided crucial support for the religious transformation that would follow. She is recorded as having been an influential spiritual figure in the court that later saw Clovis's conversion around 496. While Queen Clotilde in the court that later saw Clovis's conversion around 496. While Queen Clotilde's personal influence on her husband receives most historical attention, Genevieve's prior work had already demonstrated to Frankish leadership that Christian authority could enhance rather than threaten royal power. Her practical successes had prepared the ground for broader religious transformation. Picture the royal court during this transitional period, where pagan traditions coexisted uneasily with growing Christian influence. Genevieve served as a bridge between these worlds, showing how Christian principles could be implemented without destroying effective governance. Her presence at royal councils demonstrated that religious authority and political power could work together rather than in opposition. Her diplomatic approach consistently emphasized practical benefits alongside spiritual truths. When discussing prisoner treatment, she highlighted how mercy encouraged enemy surrenders. When addressing taxation policies, she showed how Christian principles of justice actually improved economic productivity. When considering military campaigns, Christianity as the dominant force in Frankish politics through practical demonstration rather than theological argument alone. Kings saw that Christian advisors achieved results that served royal interests while promoting spiritual values. Nobles observed that Christian principles strengthened rather than weakened political authority. Common people witnessed that Christian leadership provided more effective protection and prosperity than pagan alternatives. This diplomatic success positioned Genevieve to pursue something far more ambitious than political influence alone. Her vision extended beyond temporary alliances and immediate crises toward creating something permanent that would outlast any earthly kingdom. She began transforming the physical landscape of Paris itself, creating sacred spaces that would anchor Christian faith for generations. Picture her walking through the streets with architects and master builders, discussing plans that would establish permanent foundations for worship and community life. She encouraged building a church at Saint Denis and initiated foundations for worship and community life. She encouraged building a church at Saint Denis and initiated work that later became linked to the Basilica in Paris. These weren't monuments to personal glory, but practical investments in the spiritual infrastructure that growing Christian communities required. The construction projects faced enormous challenges in a city still recovering from years of warfare and siege. Materials remained scarce and expensive. Skilled craftsmen had scattered during previous conflicts. Financial resources had been depleted by tribute payments and military campaigns. Yet Genevieve approached these obstacles with the same faith-based determination that had characterized her responses to previous crises. Her vision for the Basilica of Saint Denis honored the martyred bishop who had brought Christianity to Paris centuries earlier. The Basilica of the Holy Apostles would celebrate the foundation of the Christian Church itself, providing a gathering place large enough for the city's growing community of believers. These buildings would serve as more than weekly worship spaces. They would function as community centers where the same organizational skills she had demonstrated during the grain mission. Stone needed quarrying and transport across difficult terrain. Timber required cutting and seasoning from forests controlled by various local authorities. Skilled masons, carpenters, and craftsmen needed recruitment from regions where they commanded high wages for their specialized knowledge. The financial requirements threatened to overwhelm any realistic budget. Yet provision appeared through both practical fundraising and what her supporters recognized as divine intervention. She mobilized contributions from across the social spectrum. Wealthy merchants provided large donations in exchange for public recognition and prayers for their business ventures. Skilled craftsmen contributed their labor at reduced rates as acts of religious devotion. Common citizens gave smaller amounts that collectively funded significant portions of the construction costs. The Vita records miraculous assistance during the building process. When workers lacked lime for mortar, she directed priests to locations where lime kilns were discovered. When construction crews faced water shortages that threatened to the Vita records that a vessel was miraculously filled after her prayer, providing the supplies needed to continue their work. Whether understood as supernatural provision or extraordinary resourcefulness, these accounts illustrate how contemporaries viewed her ability to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Kings supported these church projects as monuments that would enhance their reputations and provide visible symbols of their Christian commitment. Common citizens recognized that impressive religious buildings would attract pilgrims whose spending would benefit local businesses and craftsmen. Religious communities understood that permanent worship spaces would strengthen their ability to serve growing congregations and provide continuity across changing political circumstances. The strategic importance of these churches extended far beyond their religious functions. They influenced urban planning as neighborhoods developed around them. Their activity shaped daily rhythms as bells marked prayer times and religious festivals organized seasonal celebrations. Their presence provided stability that transcended temporary changes in government or military control. While kings rose and fell and armies conquered and retreated, churches remained as permanent fixtures that maintained Christian influence across generations. Sacred architecture proved more durable than political alliances and more enduring than military victories. These buildings housed schools where children learned reading and writing alongside religious instruction. They served as distribution centers for aid to the poor and sick. They provided meeting spaces where citizens gathered to address community problems and celebrate shared achievements. Their stone foundations anchored Christian identity throughout Paris and the surrounding region. The completion of these sacred buildings established visible symbols of divine presence that would continue inspiring believers long after their foundress had departed. Churches became centers of charity and education, shaping the character of entire neighborhoods through their ongoing activities. Their bells would call generations to prayer. Through these construction projects, Genevieve had created something that would outlast any individual life or earthly achievement. The churches she initiated would stand as permanent testimonies to faith that could move mountains and overcome impossible obstacles. They would serve communities she would never meet and provide hope for crises she would never witness. Her legacy was now written in stone and mortar, in sacred spaces that would continue her ministry long after her own voice had fallen silent. The woman who had saved Paris through prayer and practical action had now given the city permanent foundations for its Christian future. These sacred buildings would soon become the backdrop for events that would transform her from a local leader into something far greater than anyone could have imagined during her lifetime. Her passing around the turn of the 6th century marked not an end than anyone could have imagined during her lifetime. Her passing around the turn of the 6th century marked not an ending, but the beginning of her greatest miracles, as death itself became the gateway to a power that would touch countless lives across the centuries. She died around the turn of the 6th century, with many sources giving c. 500, 512, now an elderly woman whose body bore the marks of decades spent in fasting, prayer and service to Paris. She had witnessed the city's transformation from a terrified settlement facing Attila's hordes to a thriving Christian center with magnificent basilicas and a reputation for divine protection. Her work seemed complete, her legacy secured in stone and faith. The end came peacefully, with none of the dramatic circumstances that had marked so many pivotal moments in her extraordinary life. She died surrounded by friends and fellow believers who had watched her serve Paris for over half a century. Her final hours were spent in prayer, since that 7-year-old girl had received a bronze medal from Saint Genevieve. The woman who had faced down kings and commanded grain flotillas breathed her last breath with the same quiet confidence that had sustained her through every crisis. Paris mourned her death with a grief that crossed all social boundaries. Citizens who had never met her personally felt they had lost a family member. Nobles and commoners alike gathered in the streets to honor the woman whose prayers had saved their city from destruction and whose leadership had provided food during starvation. Church bells tolled throughout the day as word spread that their beloved patron had joined the saints she had served so faithfully during her earthly ministry. Her burial took place with honors typically reserved for royalty, reflecting the extraordinary respect she had earned through her service to both God and state. King Clovis himself ordered that she be interred in the Basilica of the Holy Apostles, the very church her efforts had helped construct. This placement near the tombs of kings acknowledged that her contributions and state. King Clovis himself ordered that she be interred in the Basilica of the Holy Apostles, the very church her efforts had helped construct. This placement near the tombs of kings acknowledged that her contributions to Paris and the Frankish kingdom equaled or exceeded those of any political leader. The bronze medal Saint Germanus had given her decades earlier was buried with her, completing the circle that had begun with childhood consecration. Yet questions lingered in the minds of those who gathered for her funeral. Would her influence continue beyond death? She had demonstrated remarkable power during her lifetime through prayer, prophecy, and practical leadership. Her intercession had turned aside armies, secured food during famine, and shaped the policies of kings. But death ended earthly ministry of even the most gifted servants of God. Could a woman who had worked such wonders while alive continue helping those who sought her assistance from beyond the grave? The answer came within weeks of her burial. Sick people who visited her tomb began reporting sudden healings that, suffering from fever, testified that her temperature broke immediately after touching the stone above Genevieve's grave. Parents brought children with various ailments and witnessed recoveries that amazed everyone present. Word of these miraculous healings spread throughout Paris faster than news of any political event or military victory. Families discussed the reports over evening meals. Merchants carried the stories to customers from neighboring towns. Priests found themselves answering questions about the spiritual significance of continuing miracles at Genevieve's tomb. The woman who had been respected during life was becoming revered in death. The growing stream of pilgrims seeking intercession at her resting place transformed the Basilica of the Holy Apostles into something approaching a hospital and counseling center. People traveled from distant villages, bringing sick relatives or seeking guidance for personal problems. Some came hoping for physical healing. Others sought resolution of family disputes or relief from financial troubles. All found comfort in the presence of someone whose earthly life had demonstrated God's power to solve impossible problems. All found comfort in the presence of someone whose earthly life had demonstrated God's power to solve impossible problems. Church authorities watched these developments with careful attention, documenting reported miracles and investigating claims of supernatural intervention. The formal process of recognizing sainthood required evidence that God was working through the deceased person's intercession. The steady stream of unexplained healings, answered prayers, and other miraculous events provided exactly the kind of verification that religious officials needed to support official recognition. The establishment of her cult followed naturally from the popular devotion that emerged spontaneously after her death. Formal prayers were composed requesting her intercession. Special feast days were designated to honor her memory and seek her continued protection for Paris. Artists began creating images that depicted her most famous achievements alongside symbols of her ongoing spiritual presence. Writers compiled accounts of her life and miracles for distribution to other Christian communities. Her tomb became a source of hope for desperate people facing Christ's human solution. Merchants seeking protection for dangerous journeys. Farmers praying for favorable weather. Parents worried about sick children. Soldiers preparing for battle. All found in Genevieve's resting place a connection to divine power that had proven effective during her lifetime and appeared to continue operating after her death. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Death had changed her from a local leader whose influence was limited by geography and lifespan into an eternal intercessor whose power transcended earthly boundaries. The woman who had saved Paris through prayer during her lifetime now stood ready to help anyone who approached her tomb with faith and genuine need. Her earthly ministry had ended, but her heavenly ministry was just beginning. This pattern would establish itself as the foundation for something extraordinary that would unfold over the coming centuries. Each crisis overcome through her intercession would strengthen Paris's devotion to their protector saint, creating a spiritual bond that would endure through every challenge the city would face. The historical record reveals something extraordinary. 153 times over 9 centuries. These weren't casual prayers or private devotions, but official public invocations involving processions, ceremonial descents of her relics, and community-wide appeals for divine intervention. Picture this remarkable archive that began accumulating just decades after Genevieve's death, as the city she had saved from Attila faced new threats that seemed to require the same miraculous protection. The record began with Viking raids that terrorized Paris in the late 9th century. These Norse warriors sailed up the Seine with brutal efficiency, burning villages and demanding tribute from terrified populations. When conventional military resistance proved inadequate, Parisian leaders turned to the spiritual weapon that had protected their ancestors. They carried Genevieve relics in solemn procession through. The record began with Viking raids that terrorized Paris in the late 9th century. These Norse warriors sailed up the Seine with brutal efficiency, burning villages and demanding tribute from terrified populations. When conventional military resistance proved inadequate, Parisian leaders turned to the spiritual weapon that had protected their ancestors. They carried Genevieve relics in solemn procession through the streets while citizens prayed for the same miraculous deliverance their forebears had witnessed. Each crisis that drove desperate Parisians to seek her help revealed the constant dangers of medieval urban life. Military invasions threatened from outside the city walls. Political upheavals created internal chaos as rival claimants fought for royal authority. Economic disasters brought famine when harvests failed or trade routes closed. Natural catastrophes struck without warning as floods overwhelmed neighborhoods or fires consumed entire districts. Disease outbreaks provided the most frequent occasions for invoking Saint Genevieve's protection, as medieval Paris faced regular epidemics that killed thousands within weeks. The famous 1129 ergot fever outbreak demonstrated how these public appeals operated in practice. Ergot fungus had contaminated grain supplies, causing mass poisoning that produced convulsionizing deaths throughout Paris and surrounding regions. Medical knowledge of the period could neither identify the cause nor provide effective treatment. Thousands suffered from symptoms that seemed demonic rather than natural, creating panic that threatened to destroy social order. Religious authorities responded by organizing the most elaborate procession in the city's history. They removed Genevieve's relics from their usual resting place and carried them through every neighborhood affected by the mysterious illness. Citizens lined the streets despite their own suffering, reaching out to touch the shrine as it passed their homes. Many who had been writhing in pain reportedly found immediate relief as the procession approached their locations. Imagine the scene as thousands of desperately sick people experienced sudden healing while the Saint Shrine moved through Paris streets. Children who had been convulsing became calm. Adults who had been hallucinating regained clear vision. Elderly victims who had been near death sat up and walked alongside the procession. The reports seemed too extraordinary to believe, yet they came from witnesses throughout the city who had no reason to fabricate such accounts. The number of people reportedly healed during that single procession astounded even church officials who had organized the event expecting some measure of divine intervention. Contemporary chronicles recorded that virtually everyone touched by the ergot fever found relief as the relics passed through their neighborhoods. The sudden end of an epidemic that had defied all medical treatment created a city-wide celebration that lasted for days. Pope Innocent II received detailed reports about the 1129 miracle and investigated the claims through official church channels. After confirming the extraordinary nature of what had occurred in Paris, he responded by declaring an annual feast in Genevieve's honor on November 26th. This papal recognition elevated her status from a local patron saint to a figure of international significance whose miraculous powers deserved universal acknowledgement. The feast day celebration became an annual reminder of divine protection that reinforced communal faith across generations. Regions gathered to commemorate their patron saint's continuing intercession, while reflecting on past deliverances and seeking future protection. These celebrations created shared memories that bound the community together through common experience of miraculous intervention. The pattern repeated itself through centuries of French history as Paris faced the 100 Years' War, religious conflicts, foreign invasions, and internal rebellions. Each generation discovered that the same spiritual resources their ancestors had relied upon remained effective for contemporary challenges. Political systems changed, military technology advanced, and social structures evolved, yet the fundamental relationship between Paris and its patron saint endured through every transformation. Church records from the medieval and early modern periods document the persistence of this spiritual connection despite changing circumstances and growing skepticism from educated elites. While Renaissance humanists questioned miraculous claims and Enlightenment philosophers promoted rational explanations for natural phenomena despite changing circumstances and growing skepticism from educated elites. While Renaissance humanists questioned miraculous claims and Enlightenment philosophers promoted rational explanations for natural phenomena, ordinary Parisians continued seeking Saint Genevieve's intercession when facing problems beyond human solution. Each crisis overcome strengthened, rather than weakened, this devotion through accumulated evidence of divine intervention. The 153 official invocations created a historical foundation that seemed unshakable after 9 centuries of consistent spiritual protection. Citizens recognized that their patron saint maintained active concern for their welfare, providing a source of hope that transcended temporary political upheavals or social changes. By 1791, this relationship between Paris and Saint Genevieve appeared as permanent as the stone foundations of the churches she had helped establish. 9 centuries of documented miracles had created a spiritual bond that seemed capable from forces determined to reshape French society according to entirely different principles. The revolutionary government launched its assault with unprecedented determination. Picture Paris in 1793 as radical forces seized control of the city and declared war against every trace of religious influence that had shaped French society for over 1,000 years. The same streets where citizens had once carried Saint Genevieve relics in grateful procession now echoed with angry crowds demanding the complete destruction of what they called superstitious nonsense that had kept the people enslaved to clerical authority. Revolutionary authorities targeted Saint Genevieve's cult with particular intensity because her influence represented everything they opposed about the old religious order. Her tomb in the Basilica of the Holy Apostles had attracted pilgrims for centuries, creating a center of spiritual power that competed with revolutionary ideology. Her relics had been credited with miraculous interventions that reinforced faith in divine providence rather than human reason. Her annual feast day celebrations gathered thousands of citizens in religious ceremonies that promoted loyalty to spiritual rather than political authorities. The attack began with systematic removal of religious symbols throughout Paris. Revolutionary commissioners entered churches with hammers and crowbars, destroying statues, paintings and decorative elements that depicted saints or biblical scenes. They melted down silver reliquaries and gold ornaments to fund military campaigns. They converted church buildings into meeting halls for political clubs or storage facilities for government supplies. The physical infrastructure that had supported religious worship for generations disappeared within months. Saint Genevieve's relics faced a particularly traumatic fate that the devotional tradition records as one of the darkest moments in the saint's long history with Paris. On December 3rd, 1793, officials removed her remains from their sacred resting place and transported them to Place de Grève, the public square where executions normally threw the relics into the flames, while revolutionary speakers delivered speeches about the triumph of reason over superstition. The ashes were later thrown into the Seine, marking what appeared to be the complete destruction of centuries of sacred memory. The Basilica of the Holy Apostles, where Genevieve had been buried alongside Frankish kings, underwent complete transformation as part of the revolutionary campaign to replace religious devotion with civic virtue. Officials renamed it the Panthéon and designated it as a mausoleum for great men who had served the nation through secular achievements rather than spiritual ministry. They removed Christian symbols and installed classical decorations that celebrated human reason and republican values. Revolutionary leaders promoted an alternative set of celebrations designed to replace religious festivals with patriotic ceremonies that honored the revolution rather than saints. They created new holidays celebrating revolutionary victories, republican virtues, and scientific discoveries. They organized public processions featuring revolutionary symbols instead of religious relics. They encouraged citizens to view these secular festivals as superior to the superstitious practices their ancestors had followed. Churches throughout Paris closed their doors as revolutionary authorities prohibited public worship and arrested priests who refused to swear loyalty oaths to the new political order. Religious communities scattered as convents and monasteries faced dissolution. Seminary education ended as revolutionary leaders redirected resources towards secular schools that promoted scientific knowledge over theological study. The visible infrastructure of Christianity seemed to disappear almost overnight. Yet beneath this apparent success, faith persisted among believers who refused to abandon their patron saint despite official persecution. Families continued praying to Saint Genevieve in private homes where revolutionary commissioners could not easily monitor religious activities. Small groups gathered secretly to celebrate her feast of children about her miracles through whispered stories that preserved sacred memory across generations. Some believers managed to save fragments of her relics before the public burning, hiding these precious remnants in secret locations throughout the city. Others preserved religious artwork, books, and objects associated with her cult by concealing them in private homes or rural hiding places. These underground networks maintained connections between scattered believers while protecting sacred traditions from complete destruction. The revolutionary attempt to eliminate religious influence proved less successful than its architects had hoped. While public expressions of faith disappeared temporarily, private devotion continued among citizens who found revolutionary ideology insufficient to meet their spiritual needs. Political ceremonies could not replace the comfort that believers found in prayer during times of personal crisis. Secular festivals could not provide the sense of divine protection that had sustained Parisians through centuries of difficulty. Napoleon's rise to power in 1799 brought gradual recognition that religious faith served useful social purposes that purely secular alternatives could not fulfill. In 1803, he officially revived Saint Genevieve's cult as part of his broader reconciliation with the Catholic Church. Citizens could once again openly celebrate their patron saint's feast day and seek her intercession during times of trouble. Churches reopened for public worship while maintaining appropriate respect for revolutionary political changes. Louis XVI's restoration of the Bourbon monarchy in 1814 brought even more dramatic religious revival, as the new king actively promoted traditional Catholic practices that had been suppressed during the revolutionary period. In 1822, he ordered construction of a new chapel dedicated to Saint Genevieve, providing a proper location for religious services honoring Paris's patron saint. Some fragments of her relics that had survived the revolutionary destruction were eventually recovered and enshrined, with the chapel at Saint-Étienne-du-Mont housing remaining relics that continue to draw pilgrims seeking her intercession. The failure of revolutionary efforts to destroy religious relics that continue to draw pilgrims seeking her intercession. The failure of revolutionary efforts to destroy religious memory revealed fundamental truths about human nature that political theories had ignored. Sacred traditions possess staying power that transcended temporary political circumstances because they addressed spiritual needs that secular ideologies could not satisfy. Communities maintained collective memories that survived official attempts at historical revision. Popular devotion proved more durable than government propaganda when it had been tested through centuries of genuine experience. These attempts to erase sacred memory ultimately demonstrated its enduring power, showing that spiritual connections between communities and their patron saints could survive even the most determined political opposition. The story that began with a young woman's impossible plan to save Paris through prayer had proven that faith and courage create legacies that outlast earthly kingdoms. Today, Saint Genevieve remains Paris's patron saint, her story demonstrating how divine power works through human courage and collective action. Contemporary sources credited her with both heavenly dependence and earthly responsibility. Her legacy teaches us that spiritual warfare combines intense prayer with practical leadership, showing that authentic faith expresses itself through works. She transformed from a consecrated virgin into a diplomatic leader, proving that God uses ordinary people who choose extraordinary trust in divine protection. Let her example inspire your own faith tonight, knowing that no challenge proves too great when faced with unwavering trust and community unity. May you rest in the same divine protection that has watched over Paris for 15 centuries, and community unity. May you rest in the same divine protection that has watched over Paris for 15 centuries.